I wanted to spend a couple minutes on today's video talking about the news over the weekend that came out. It came out, I guess, around noontime on Saturday, that the Baltimore Orioles had relieved manager Brandon Hyde of his duties, that he had been fired. And it's something that I think on its surface was not entirely surprising. The Orioles have had a very difficult start to the 2025 season. Not all of it is Brandon Hyde's fault, of course, and we'll get into some of that. But the fact of the matter is, in pro sports, when a team is underperforming and the expectations were very high, somebody has to pay the price. And most of the time, the players don't fire themselves, neither does the general manager, which a lot of people here believe should be the case, but usually there are going to be scapegoats. And in this case, Brandon Hyde is that proverbial scapegoat. So obviously, the Orioles have had quite an interesting couple of years here. Brandon Hyde was hired in 2018, which, as it so happened to be, was the beginning of this rebuild period, which the Orioles went through, where they lost a lot of games, 118, a lot of losses, 100 plus losses in 3 full seasons, the 2020 season being excluded. And then it was a lot of losing baseball. So there was a lot of losing baseball that Brandon Hyde was there for. And I think kudos to the Orioles, he was able to see through a lot of that. Because finally in 2022, the team began to turn the corner a little bit. And then it was only in 2023 and 2024 when they finally made the playoffs. They didn't win any of the series in the playoffs, however. And that was frustrating to a lot of Birds fans. But in 23, you remember they lost to the Texas Rangers, who ultimately went on to win the World Series. Last autumn, they lost to a Kansas City Royal team that then ultimately was defeated by the New York Yankees. So last year, I think, was more disappointing than the previous year. The previous year, they were just so happy to be in the playoffs for the first time in so long, but last year was a little more disappointing. So the expectations were a little higher here in 25, and they just haven't lived up to that. They're 15 and 30 at the time of this recording, and there's been underperformance all the way around. The starting rotation has been awful. It's been a bottom 5 unit in Major League Baseball. And it's been very frustrating considering that the Orioles had Corbin Burnes in the rotation last year, who is a Cy Young contender on an annual basis. Now, the Orioles made a competitive offer for Corbin Burnes this winter, but Burnes, he just wanted to be in Arizona, which was closer to where he lived. And it is a team, Arizona, admittedly, that has a very strong chance to contend for not only a playoff spot, but also the World Series. So the Orioles lost Corbin Burnes in the offseason, and they replaced him with Charlie Morton, who is definitely on the back end of his career at this point, given his age and his results. And they also signed this player named Tomoyuki Sugano from Japan, who's been good, but clearly hasn't been enough to make up for, again, what I said was a bottom 5 ERA from their starters in Major League Baseball, pitching to an almost 5.5 plus ERA. So it's been very bad from that point of view. And then also offensively, this team, there's been a couple guys in this lineup who haven't started out very strong. It is early, of course, there's time to turn it around, but they need to see a little bit more from someone like Adley Rutschman, who not only had a slow start to this season, but also last season, the second half of the season, his bat kind of slowed down a little bit. They're not getting what they expected from someone like Jordan Westburg. Gunnar Henderson was on the injured list to begin the season. You get the idea, and the injuries have affected this club too. Of course, they've been without the services of Grayson Rodriguez for a large portion of it, and that's just to name a few. Tyler O'Neill is injured once again. So there's struggles all the way around for this Oriole team, and it's not surprising that they would find a scapegoat here in Brandon Hyde. Brandon Hyde is not responsible for all this. He can't possibly be, and I still think he could be a very good manager. And he had to deal with a lot of losing baseball early on in his tenure. But this is what happens in these kind of situations, and you've seen now they've promoted the interim manager. He's going to be Tony Mansolino. So it'll be interesting to see what they do the remainder of the season, because if they continue to perform poorly and the results don't change, then I think Mike Elias, as general manager of the club, needs to be on the hot seat. And I think David Rubenstein, the owner, would recognize that and make the appropriate change in the wintertime, in the off season. For now, the question is they need to squeeze a lot more out of the younger players on this roster. They're talented, but they haven't shown it just yet. And I think the goal for the interim manager and for Elias will be trying to squeeze as much as they can out of this roster before it's too late. At this point, the Orioles just need to make the postseason, but they also need to further the development of so many young players on this roster in order to make an accurate judgment about 2026 and beyond. Because a lot of the questions about these younger players will need to be answered in order for them to know what they need to get in free agency, what they need to get in the trade market. These are all things that they need to have answers to, and Elias and the interim manager will be tasked with trying to get that out of them. So it's a very interesting situation. I know a lot of people felt that Hyde was not the right guy. They should have fired Elias. Listen, Elias is going to be on the hot seat if this team doesn't perform well here the remainder of the season. And they decided to make this change now. This is the time of year when you make these managerial changes. Another team in the division, John Schneider with the Blue Jays, I think it's interesting if this Blue Jays team has a bad week here, watch his name, because his name has been frequently floated out there. He doesn't have a long-term contract to be manager of the Blue Jays, and I think it's an interesting question to watch, particularly as we head out through the remainder of this first half of the season. So Brandon Hyde is gone. He's the third manager in Major League Baseball to be fired within the last week and a half. And I wonder about John Schneider in Toronto, as his seat seems to get hot.